Wait. We're now live.
Good evening and welcome to the Post-Primary 25 live stream, the definitive look at this Tuesday's Democratic and Republican gubernatorial and legislative primary election results. With me are Zach Blackburn, the Trenton reporter for the New Jersey Globe, Ryan Dubicki, the election researcher for the Associated Press, Joey Fox, the Washington reporter for the New Jersey Globe, David Wildstein, the editor of the New Jersey Globe, and I'm Micah Rasmussen, director of the Rebovich Institute for New Jersey Politics at Rider University. Well, New Jersey has not seen a primary election with this many great candidates in a long time, and more voters responded with their participation than any other primary in a generation. 800,000 Democrats voted, more than 457,000 Republicans did. We haven't seen 1.25 million voters in any primary since 2020, the presidential year, and not in an odd-numbered year since 1989. Both parties come out of this primary with clear consensus nominees. For the Republicans, Jack Ciattarelli, who carried all 21 counties and beat his nearest opponent by 46 points. For the Democrats, Micah Sherrill, who bested a field full of her party's top contenders. She carried all but 6 counties, coming in second in 5 of those, and she beat her nearest opponent by 13.5 points. Just like that, our general election matchups for governor, assembly, and county and local races are now set. So my question for the panel, the first one, question number 1, how did Al Barlas do?
He won his primary with flying colors.
Okay.
Truly, it was really incredible to see.
Question number 2, David. Do you want to take us through what happened in the sort of the epicenter here, which was Hudson County? Do you want to tell us what you think the rundown was from top to bottom here?
Yeah, I mean, Hudson's a fascinating place this year. Steve Fulop's home county. Initially, Anthony Vanieri was the county chair. He endorsed Fulop. It looked like Fulop was going to be okay at home. It went south, and a big group, including the county executive, Craig Guy, Brian Stack, Albio Ceres, Richard Turner, Jimmy Davis, they all endorsed Josh. They all said that if Josh Gottheimer ran, they would support him. And Josh Gottheimer ran, and they switched to Micah Sherrill. And this is, as we talk about what were the components of the Sherrill win, it was her ability to flip Hudson. It was her ability to move that group of big producers from Gottheimer to her. And she did it by saying, calling people and saying, okay, you've made your decision, but if circumstances changed, I'd like to be considered. And she didn't cut them off. She continued to work there. So you had in Hudson County this year a war. And in Hudson County, sometimes they have wars and sometimes they have warettes. And the attempt to take out Tom DeGeese as county executive and change the county chair, that was a warette. That was a battle where the fire got put out. It was nothing terrible. This was a full-grown war in Hudson County, and it came at a time when organization lines went away. So this Hudson County line, which typically neutralizes these wars and beats these warettes, they had to come up with another way of winning elections. And, a whole lot of credit goes to Craig Guy, the county executive and the county chairman. He was dealing with Mayor Fulop at one end. He was dealing with Micah Sherrill and trying to get her through. He was dealing with challenges to legislative seats because some of the incumbent legislators ran with Steve Fulop. And what wound up happening is the organization won. First of all, Micah Sherrill won Hudson County. And I don't know that many of us had that on our bingo card a year ago, that Micah Sherrill was going to win Hudson County, but she did. and this will be part of what we'll talk about tonight in terms of her group, but they included in the war was and all politics is local, a race for sheriff. And a constitutional office in an urban county where there's a political machine is a big deal. And they convinced, they being Craig Guy and Brian Stack, convinced Jimmy Davis, the mayor of Bayonne, to run against Frank Scolari, who was a 5-term incumbent. So the 5-term incumbent ran on the full-up slate as the Democrats for Change candidate. Davis won that. So what you have in that situation is literally a move of a sheriff's office from one account, the account of Nick Sacco, the mayor of North Bergen. Scolari was his guy, to the account of Craig Guy and Brian Stack. And with that, in 6 assembly races in 3 districts, they walked away with 4 of the 6 states, and that's I think that's pretty incredible that they were able to do that. 2 of those weren't so bad. That was the Stack district, and Stack did I would tend to joke usually and say he did 7,205 pieces of mail. In reality, it was 32 pieces of mail in a legislative primary, which is just as extraordinary. And armies of people out there, they blew that Sacco team away in this Union City, West New York, North Bergen district, and they held the 31st district with Will Sampson and they got Jerry Walker, a really popular county commissioner, to run. In the 32nd district, Jessica Ramirez lost. She was on the full-up slate, and this is the district where Katie Brennan won and Ravi Bala. They weren't on the full-up slate, so there was just an independent slate. So the full-up slate won 0 legislative races. The HCDO team won 4, and an independent team won 2 that were more aligned with Jersey City Councilman James Solomon, who's running for mayor, than anything else. So this is like a huge win for the organization, who proved that they can win primaries without a line. And as we sort of look at redefining how New Jersey politics is in this post-line era, what we're seeing, and we'll talk about this more tonight, is in a lot of counties, they figured out how to reinvent themselves and still win elections.
So, Joey, or let me start with Ryan, actually. Ryan, I'm noticing that the amount that Fulop won Jersey City by, just a hair under 10,000 votes, is smaller than the margin that Baraka won Newark by. Now, we haven't bled over to Essex County yet, but what do you make out of Fulop's performance in his own backyard?
Simply put, like as you mentioned, he barely won Jersey City. I'm looking at my breakdown now. He only won in Hudson County, only won Bayonne, Harrison, North Bergen, of the other towns. And the other towns, either Mikey Sherrill did very well in, and then East Newark, which is, only had 160 votes total, Baraka won. So he clearly underperformed in Hudson County. I think we all thought he would do much better. How that compares to Newark, I think it's more apples to oranges because of different counties and different communities. But yeah, he simply he underperformed, even though the advance vote was the highest after in-person early voting, and Jersey City led the advance vote, and it made him very confident. I think we all thought that those advance voters that were leading the state thought they would favor him more, but it turns out it didn't. Why that happened, I think there's a million theories we could all assume. But yeah, he did. He's simply put, I think he could have done better statewide had he done better in Hudson. I think that was a key for Fulop to especially like make it a closer race. I think he was banking a lot on Hudson County. But yeah, I think, we could analyze for hours why he didn't do as well. But simply put, yeah, he barely won Jersey City, Bayonne, and North Bergen and Harrison.
I mean, I'll throw in quickly. I feel like other than Sherrill, obviously, who had enough of a base to win by a pretty convincing margin, the only other Democratic candidate who had sort of like a strong enough base to really do much statewide was Baraka. And we were sort of talking about this in our pre-election live stream and in a bunch of other settings too, obviously, because this has been sort of the dynamic of the race. This is a bunch of candidates who each have their own home turfs, and it's going to be both a battle of winning those home turfs by as much as possible and competing for sort of like the in-between areas where either no one really has an advantage or where they can maybe sort of bite into other candidates' turfs. And this is just, you sort of look statewide and you see, okay, Josh Gottheimer won Bergen County, like most towns there, but not by that much. It wasn't enough to give him much of a cushion statewide, and then he just didn't really.
Right. He came out 12,000 votes ahead of Sherrill in Bergen County. That was a drop.
It's just kind of piddling when we're talking about a statewide coalition. And he just never sort of caught on anywhere else in a way that would have made up for that. Steve Sweeney, I think his situation was even worse, where he was able to catch on specifically in like his home legislative district. And then even in the rest of South Jersey, which was expected to be at least modestly Sweeney territory, he didn't really have it. It just voters weren't really that interested. And he lost Camden County, he lost Cape May County, he lost all these counties that a South Jersey candidate probably really shouldn't be losing in this kind of circumstance. And then you get to Fulop, where, he was supposed to have kind of the Jersey City base, or the Fulop who won this election would have had the Jersey City, sort of urban Hudson County base combined with suburban strength elsewhere and sort of coming in second in a lot of towns where he would just steadily build up his vote all around the state. And none of that fully panned out, where, yeah, you come out of Jersey City with a couple of 100 vote margin, that's not going to get you anywhere. And sort of like Gottheimer, he didn't catch on anywhere else in a way that would have, made up for that. So I guess, I started this by saying that Baraka was the exception. Baraka is the exception. You look at towns all around the state that have big Black populations and, importantly, big Hispanic populations. I think we didn't really know before this how Hispanic voters were going to go. We thought that Sherrill could have an in. We thought that Fulop could have an in. We thought that Baraka could have an in. We thought that Gottheimer maybe could have an in. Gottheimer was definitely pushing for that too. I haven't had the chance to dive so deeply into the numbers enough yet to make a sort of definitive pronouncement, but a lot of places that felt sort of like swing, no one really has a full claim to this town kind of areas like New Brunswick or Patterson with big Hispanic populations, Baraka cleaned up. And then you get to places like Trenton or obviously Newark and East Orange and these heavily Black towns. I mean, it was dominant. So it wasn't enough for Baraka to win, but it was enough for Baraka to sort of come out of this with his head held high saying, I did what I wanted to do. I got all these votes. I got this kind of coalition to work for me in a way that the other four Democratic runners up can't really do.
Yeah. I mean, it was enough to make him second place as of now. So, yeah.
Yeah. The other noteworthy thing, of course, about Baraka's race is that he carried Essex County. He carried Union County. And in neither of those spots was he the endorsed candidate. The endorsed candidate came in second, Mikey Sherrill, in both of those places, but he wound up prevailing over the county organizations in both of those places. That's significant.
Yeah,
that's something that didn't used to happen, right? Or didn't happen very often.
Well, actually, I would respectfully disagree with that. When I'm going way back, but when the Essex organization in 81 and 85 endorsed somebody else, Ken Gibson, the mayor of Newark, won Essex County. And in Union County, I think there was a screening committee vote to endorse Sherrill, but Nick Scutari never actually endorsed anybody. He stayed out of that. So you didn't have, him out there really pushing votes. He was, he was playing sort of that role of the statewide official. And by the way, he didn't have to play in those places. He's the Senate president. They're all going to need him anyway, and they're going to need him in the general election. So he played it perfectly. But in Essex, I don't think that anybody really expected Sherrill to win Essex because of the idea that Baraka had this base a large base in a 6-candidate field. I look at Irvington and Tony Voss, the mayor of Irvington, Renee Burgess, the state senator, Mrs. Beasley, the municipal chair of Irvington. They all endorsed Mikey Sherrill, but they knew that Irvington was going to go for Baraka. Leroy Jones in East Orange, he knew it was a hard sell to tell people in East Orange that they couldn't vote for Ras Baraka and to try and sell them. So this is an election where, without a line, people made their own decisions because you didn't have that advantageous ballot position and ballot Siberia, and people weren't hard to find. So, I think this election, not since 1981 have we had one like this where people were making up their own minds. I'll tell you one other number that I found really fascinating is when you put together some of the smaller Republican counties in Western New Jersey. Mikey Sherrill won Morris, the combination of Morris, Sussex, Warren, Hunterdon by 38,000 votes. Mm-hmm. She got 38,000 votes out of those 4 counties. She got more votes in Western New Jersey than Ras Baraka did in Essex County, or than Josh Gottheimer got in Bergen, or Fulop got in Hudson, or and we'll talk about South Jersey, I'm sure. But those kinds of let's assemble, let's play everywhere, let's run a 21 strategy, a 21 county strategy really paid off.
I do want to just quickly say, David, Micah makes the point about how this is sort of unusual for Essex County to vote against the endorsed candidate. And you're like, oh, it's not so unprecedented. Let me bring up an election from before 3 of the 5 panelists on this were born. So, it is, for some of us, it feels very unprecedented. How's that?
I will say for Essex, though, I'm looking at the towns now, for either Baraka, for the towns where Baraka won, he did very well margin-wise, and the towns Sherrill won, she did very well margin-wise. So these were heavily decisive margins for maybe except Maplewood and West Orange, but the other towns, they were clear decisive margins for both of them. So
Ryan, what was Maplewood? Tell me about Maplewood and South Orange.
They're the most evenly split towns in the entire state, I think, or close to it. I mean, I was just looking at those myself. But anyway, sorry, keep going.
Maplewood, Sherrill won 31%, Baraka won 20%, Fulop 30%. So it's clearly not a decisive victory. And South Orange, said David, that's 29% Sherrill, 27% Baraka, and 24% Fulop. So I think these.
Wait, is that right? I thought the Fulop won South Orange.
Oh, he did. I'm sorry. I read Fulop won South Orange. Correct. Yeah.
And that's where his running mate, Sheena Collum, is from.
Right.
To put it,
the town, that was the type of town that we thought was going to be, or at least the Fulop who did better than the Fulop who performed on election night. That was the kind of town where he was supposed to get a ton of the vote. That was the type of train station, highly energized, really active. There were Fulop flyers all over the town. And if he's only winning it with, it's impressive that he won it, I guess, against 2 candidates who had their own really strong bases. But the fact that he's only winning it by a tiny little margin is just, again.
Well, look, that was Sherrill's. These towns are in Mikey Sherrill's congressional district. They support her when she runs for Congress by big numbers. They will support her by big numbers in a general election. But to put it in perspective for people across the state that aren't Essex County centric like I am, these days Maplewood and South Orange make Montclair look like Alabama. These are very strongly progressive, highly informed voters. And if Steve Fulop was going to win this primary, it was going to be by putting together those big margins in those kinds of towns all over the state.
Well, let's talk for another minute about the Fulop situation. I've been accused of seeing too much there. But one thing I put together last night was if you look at, you can never count, you have to be very careful when you look at assembly races because you get 2 votes for the assembly. But if you take the better performing of the 2 assembly candidates of each of his districts that he had candidates in, if you take the mayors that he had, mayoral races where he had alliances like Edison and Camden, and you take his running mate, there were over 200,000 votes for Democrats for Change statewide. There were at least 75,000 votes for Democrats for Change that did not wind up going to Fulop. So his running mates did significantly better than he did. So there was something going on out there in these meetings that were going on across the state. They just didn't wind up all translating into votes for him.
I mean, I think that this is just sort of, and we're going to get to this more in terms of talking about these various assembly races and stuff, but we are all, and certainly, you know, the party leaders of New Jersey and the candidates who are running are still thinking about this from a little bit of sort of the old county line perspective, where we think about when someone has a running mate, you know, it's part of the slate and the voters are going to think of that as a slate. But I think that both in terms of the Democrats for Change Fulop running mates and in terms of the independent candidates, I mean, it looks like there could be as many as 4 state assembly members who ran on independent tickets that were neither associated with Fulop or the county party. It's pretty clear that voters were approaching those sort of as distinct entities. They were thinking about who do I want as governor, and then they were thinking about who do I want as state assembly member. And those two were could be divorced from each other. I think a really good example of that is the 34th legislative district, where Brittany Claybrooks, former East Orange councilwoman, came within, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but a couple percentage points of unseating Assemblyman Mike Venezia.
1,000 votes.
Yeah. And that's not because Fulop was winning that district. I don't think he did particularly well in it. I think he probably came in 3rd in the district to Mike Sherrill and Ras Baraka. But clearly voters were not thinking about that assembly race along the same lines as they were thinking about the governor's race. I think that there was a big element of racial voting where the party ticket had a Hispanic candidate and a white candidate, and Black voters in places like East Orange and the city of Orange gravitated heavily towards Brittany Claybrooks, who's Black. And so that meant that there were a bunch of Baraka Claybrooks voters. That's like a whole different kind of calculation than the straight ticket, you know, Democrats for Change slate. So clearly there was sort of a general, and you could see that repeated, I think, in a number of different other assembly races where these Democrats for Change candidates sort of caught on in ways that Fulop didn't necessarily. So I think that you can kind of talk about this broad universe of like reform interested voters, or voters who for one reason or another, be it ideology, be it race, be it just, you know, local sort of issues or problems, were in the mood for change from their incumbent representation, but that does not necessarily translate into the gubernatorial candidate who is preaching that change the most.
Yeah,
I think Cheryl in the closing stretch, maybe because she conserved her money, maybe because she had the good messaging, but I think that she was able to convince many of those reform-minded voters that their best shot for governor was to go with Cheryl.
Yeah. You know, one of the other things that I see here is, you know, we talk a lot, and I talk a lot about, you know, the elimination of the line, because that's a reality. But one of the things in a number of places is that the organizations reinvented themselves. The county chairs, this was do or die for county chairs. Either the organization endorsement was going to matter, or going forward, people wouldn't respect it as much. And, you know, you look at places, you look at Middlesex County, you know, they were able to hold, you know, they were able to deliver for their candidate, which was Mikey Sherrill. And I'm talking about like the real organization places, you know, place like Middlesex came through, but then you go to Camden, and Mikey Sherrill beats Steve Sweeney. Now, not only would I have not believed that going into primary night, but when I was seeing Camden vote by mail numbers at 8:03 p.m. and I see Sherrill leading, like I just figured somebody loaded something into the, you know, into the computer incorrectly, because it just didn't make sense. And, you know, and so Sherrill's margin to me comes from a couple things. One, and by the way, she won by 14 points. That's impressive. I mean, it's just impressive. It means that this, this campaign that was run, which had a lot of different parts to it, but a lot of, they all clicked, which is the organizations that she had came through for her. And I don't think she lost. I don't think she lost any counties where she had won a convention. I'm talking about a screening committee. Some not as well as others. Passaic was less impressive, but Middlesex, Mercer County, where she had Janice Mironoff and Dan Benson, that came in strong. Monmouth, with Vin Gopal and the county chair. These were, Dias Davis. They all, they all were delivering, and combine that with the fact that Mikey Sherrill was sort of going retail. She was going direct to voters. We're talking about a time where you don't have newspapers really filtering it anymore. People are getting their information from different places. And, you look, why did Mikey Sherrill win Camden? And by the way, the answer is, I don't know. I really don't know, but I think it may just be that she was on Philly TV, that she was running a 21 county strategy, that she went on, she was on digital. She was targeting her voters correctly. They had a large turnout, about 63% of the Democratic turnout in the state were women. And by the way, not all women voted for Mikey Sherrill, and Mikey Sherrill got plenty of men voting for her too. But when you're a lower information voter, and you don't have the line in a place like Camden, and there was no, that you didn't have that advantage on a ballot, then they're deciding. They're seeing TV commercials, they're reading their mail, they're looking at their digital, and they're saying, oh, I like Mikey Sherrill best, which is sort of what I think, Andy Kim and Zahid Qureshi might have had in mind.
One element you did have about Camden, though, that you did say, you didn't say this was going to recruit to Sherrill, but you said, look, Sweeney has not run in Camden County before. So even though he's the South Jersey candidate, and even though he's certainly somebody whose name is known in South Jersey, he's not somebody who Camden County voters were used to voting for in any way, shape, or form. So in a sense, a little bit of an even playing field with Sherrill in that sense, that neither one of them had run before in the county.
Yeah, and what I thought was going to happen in Camden County turned out to be wrong. I thought Sweeney was going to win because the organization was for him, and he was going to come out of there not with Jim Florio, Rob Andrews kind of numbers, but still a win. And I thought that Fulop was going to get a lot of that progressive vote, which it had a significant number. I didn't see Sean Spiller come in third in Camden County, where he just sort of registered more. Ryan, how did Baraka do in the city of Camden, where he had Mayor Karstaffin's endorsement?
It was Camden specifically. It was a very diluted, margin with all the candidates. Sherrill won 9% in Camden. Baraka, he lost Camden. He only won 20. He got 21%. Spiller won Camden with 29%. And Sweeney 26%, Fulop 10%, and Gottheimer 5%. So Camden was very diluted with that vote. I will say, I'm looking at the voter history right now in our tabulation system for Camden County. And in the first report, the margin between Sherrill and Sweeney was actually bigger when Camden released their vote by mail votes, and it actually shrunk as the election vote came in. So the margin with Sweeney did decrease throughout the night, but Camden State, back to Camden State specifically, it was very diluted. Yeah, why that is the case, I'm not sure. Why Spiller won Camden City, we'll never know. I'd love to know. I'd love to ask those voters, but Yeah, it's interesting how diluted the vote was. I mentioned this on Thursday. I would love to see what a runoff would look like if New Jersey had runoffs, with like a top two, what like Cheryl and Baraka, what a matchup would look like with that. But we'll never know.
No, we won't. Go ahead, Joe.
This is something that that Matt Friedman pointed out today, that Spiller won Cumberland County and then did by far better in South Jersey counties than anywhere else. And my strong suspicion is that the NJEA super PAC that spent $45 million on him. I don't know what the precise media market breakdown is, but I have to think that's a South Jersey versus North Jersey media market kind of difference, where they just spent more in the Philly market than anywhere else. And it's also worth noting that we were talking about Baraka as sort of like the candidate for black voters. Sean Spiller, also a black candidate. And so if voters in, say, Camden City, or I see that Spiller also won Lawnside, and I again haven't looked at these super closely yet, but a variety of sort of diverse towns in South Jersey. If there's two black candidates on the ballot, you're a black voter or a Hispanic voter, say, who's interested in voting for a candidate of color. It's much more likely that you were actually reached by Spiller, by his mailers, by his TV ads, than you were by Baraka. So I can at least kind of see the logic in how that would end up happening, even though it wasn't really how we were reading this race before Election Day.
Yeah, I mean,
I think you're right.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna force it to Zach, because Zach needs to talk some.
Okay.
Well, but in our pre-primary stream, I made the statement that 5 Democrats could win a county in this primary. I could take that as a victory, but technically, I did not have Sean Spiller winning Cumberland in that calculus. I was counting Steve Fulop as one of the 5 candidates. So that, I don't know fully what happened there. I can say anecdotally, which, it's only anecdotes, so it can only go so far. But in South Jersey, I saw much more Sean Spiller stuff than I saw from him in other parts of the state in my limited ventures down south. It even started last year, and I believe I saw a report. It might have been Ad Impact. I don't know exactly. I don't remember exactly where. But Sean Spiller did spend much more money in the Philly media market relative to New York than most other candidates, except for Steve Sweeney, which, as the South Jersey candidate, you expect.
And that's the kind of thing that, that sort of nice second place finish in South Jersey would have been a great kind of compliment to like a home base in North Jersey. But instead he had the opposite of a home base in North Jersey, where he was mayor of Montclair, and the Montclair voters put him in 5th place in their town.
5th place.
So yeah. It was the kind of thing where you had kind of the harder element of the statewide coalition, but the sort of more baseline element of having a place where you're getting a lot of votes because they know you and they know to vote for you was just totally missing.
Now, Ryan, how did Atlantic City do? What did Atlantic City vote?
Fulop won Atlantic City, not by a lot, but he won 30% of it, and then Baraka won 27%, and Spiller came in 3rd with 14%, and Sweeney came in 4th with 12 votes behind Spiller at 14% also. Again, very diluted vote. I will say, back to just the whole Cumberland thing, the first 20 minutes, at least from the AP vote tab perspective, was the most bizarre 20 minutes in a primary I've ever seen, because Gloucester was first to report, and it was the vote by mail and early votes in Gloucester, and it was Sweeney. We were like, okay, we figured he would do very well, but we didn't figure he would win. So we're like, all right, so for the first 5 minutes, Sweeney was winning the race statewide. And then Hudson came in 2nd, which with Cheryl winning. It's like, all right, that's kind of somewhat expected. Fulop's underperforming. And then Cumberland came in 3rd with Spiller winning. And then we're like, what the hell is going on? We have three different winners, 3 different leaders, in 3 different counties. We were this close, calling to Cumberland, because we figured we were so unprepared for Spiller to do that well in Cumberland. So yeah, it was a crazy 20 minutes of one of my life, honestly. But and I just want to put that out there. But yeah, Atlantic City wise, I mean, it was a very diluted margin, with Fulop only winning 30%. And Gottheimer only won 3% Atlantic City, so with only 127 votes. So Atlantic City voters do not like Gottheimer, clearly.
There's another
in Atlantic City, though. You have to give, as you compare Atlantic City to Camden, Mayor Marty Small, an early supporter of Fulop, was able to deliver Steve Fulop a first place finish there. Despite what might have been a place where Baraka should have done well. Marty Small delivered when Mayor Karstafen couldn't, and you get issues. I mean, that you want to talk about how what we'll look at later is did the people who endorsed Steve Fulop, were they able to deliver for him? For example, I don't know what Westfield was, and Westfield is a town where you had the mayor, Shelley Brindle, was for Fulop very, very early, but Brian's looking it up.
I don't think we have Union yet.
No, we don't have Union yet.
Yeah, we never, and that's one of the late ones that comes out, but.
Can I quickly throw something in? I was looking back at my text because Ryan, you were talking about the specific order of counties, and also just quickly, kudos to all of New Jersey's county clerks for counting votes faster than I've ever seen them count. That was great stuff. Yeah. I mean, we still have a couple of sort of slightly unclear races because there's just a couple of assembly races that are very close. But that's not the county clerk's fault. That's what voters did. In terms of getting us clear results pretty fast, they were great. Yeah. And so just with those early drops from Gloucester, and then I think it was Hudson, Cumberland, Essex. I was looking back through my text with David and Zach, and at 8:06 p.m., so 6 minutes after polls closed, I texted, okay, so it's clearly going to be Mikey, right? Because it's just the kind of thing where we already had sort of enough information in those early drops that it was looking like no candidate's coalition was kind of going to work other than Cheryl's.
Ryan, that was that 2022 law that allows the ballots to be prepared for tabulation 5 days ahead of the election, right?
Yep. Title 19, Chapter 6, 1963-22C.
And that's since the last gubernatorial election. So when we talk about that slow count of 2021, the legislature and the governor fixed that and allowed for this faster count to take place, and we saw the results of that. I mean, two things. Obviously, Cheryl was ahead and Citarelli was ahead, so we didn't have these close races. But certainly, the faster count is a result of that law change.
I also want to say voters also return their mail ballots much earlier than usual, because if you guys have looked at the A5176 reports that the counties are uploading, they have hardly any mail ballots left to process. So kudos to mail voters to get their ballots in early, because I always advocate for that. So there's no backlog post-election night. And
by the way, aside from Micah's open, we're at 8:37, and I just heard Citarelli's name mentioned. So we shouldn't.
Well, I mentioned him in the open. I did.
You did. But since the open, we haven't gotten to him, so we should. But I want to, before we finish the Democrats, there were two, there were two other numbers that I thought were interesting, and I mentioned, a large, turnout among women, almost 20% more than men, but. And I realize it's not this simple. I realize that I'm speaking in a broad generality. But three candidates for governor who openly identified as progressive Democrats, Steve Fulop, Raz Baraka, and Sean Spiller, they combined for 47% of the vote, which is a significant block as you look toward future primaries in this state, that this number that's going for progressives in primaries is increasing. And by the way, among the things that that I think we could take away from that too is Mikey Sherrill. It's not like Mikey Sherrill didn't, who is who doesn't call herself a progressive. I'd say she's a liberal Democrat. I don't think she's a progressive. But it's not like progressive Democrats don't like Mikey Sherrill. And two things that I saw there that I thought was interesting is Sherrill won Sussex County by 20 points, and she won Warren County by 12 points. And those are the two counties that went for Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton. So arguably the two in a Democratic primary, two of the most progressive counties in the state went for Mikey Sherrill. And I think that's, I'd like to hear what you all think of this, but this this progressive bloc in New Jersey primaries has been increasing over the last few years, and they're not winning, but I think this is sort of part of the new world order. Micah, do you think these progressive numbers of 47% from progressive candidates, how much is that tied to the fact that there's no line anymore?
Oh, well, I think the fact that I think it follows this route. So the line, one thing we can clearly attribute to the line, I think, is the increased number of candidates who are jumping into these races. Right, we saw that in the Payne special election to replace him. We saw that certainly this year. It is not scaring candidates away. Good candidates are getting in because they perceive the barriers to be lower. When these progressive candidates are getting in the race, it is attracting the interest of more progressive voters who are then participating in the primary process and supporting them. Now, we'll talk more about this sense of that Joey has pushed back on people like Matt Friedman. It's not like there's one progressive lane, and we shouldn't assume that. But if there are three progressive candidates in the race, then they are to some extent splitting whatever vote of progressive voters there are. And so at some point, you might get a race where there's one progressive, and you might see what happens. Do they get all of those progressive votes? We don't know the answer to that because people are going to support the candidate that they want to support. However, I think the increased activity of progressive voters comes from the increased activity of progressive candidates, and that is coming from the end of the line.
I think I think it's partly important to remember too that not all of this voting was ideological in nature. I think if you ask a lot of Black urban voters who might have voted for Hillary Clinton in the primaries that David mentioned, they might consider themselves even at times conservative Democrats, not necessarily progressive or fully liberal, but they probably still showed up and voted for their mayor because they like their mayor. There's reasons to vote for people historically that go beyond ideology. And I think that sort of speaks to an interesting part of Cheryl's campaign too, where I think, David mentioned Spiller, Fulop, and Baraka labeling or going for the progressive lane, really sometimes the leftist lane.
Mm-hmm.
Gottheimer and Sweeney went for the moderate centrist lane. Cheryl, there's a reason that mainstream Democrats are mainstream, and I think you could use liberal, but in many ways, Cheryl, I think, is just a prototypical mainstream Democrat who a lot of progressives can look at her and say, she's good, she's strong, I could vote for her, and the same goes for moderates. And in some ways, I think she might have been the only candidate without a lane. And I think you see that when you look at just her consistent strength throughout the state.
And look, one of the things that's undeniable about the Cheryl numbers, because she won by 14 points over the second place finisher, is voters liked her. They liked her resume. They learned who she was, and there were people, and I was one of them from time to time, who thought, wow, this is all about resume, maybe some, more specific things, but the voters liked her. The voters, and so it's hard now to look at this campaign and say they really did things wrong when they won by significant amount and they got it right. And, I hate to admit it. I really do. I hope that Alex Ball and Sean Higgins and Jackie Burns and everybody there hold their ears, because I really don't want them to hear this, but they got things right. They knew this better than I did. They were right and I was wrong. And Mikey Cheryl, and I'm going to say the same thing about Jack Ciattarelli when we get to this. We're going into a general election where the parties are happy with their nominee, and where both of them showed that they had mass appeal. They're not, it's sort of, I apologize, Joey and Ryan and Zach, that I'm going to talk about something that happened, 44 years ago again, but it sort of reminds me of Tom Kaine and Jim Florio in 81. Kaine won the primary with like 30% and Florio, in the high 20s. But it wasn't like the party was splintered. It wasn't like they had trouble getting everybody behind them. It was, the parties nominated a candidate who demonstrated an appeal to voters. And I think with Sherrill and Chitterelli, that's what we're looking at now. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't have said the same thing if other candidates had won the primaries, but this is what happened. And, these were some good campaigns, and this is how it's supposed to be. Voters, it's not like voters didn't have access to information when you had $125+ million being spent in these campaigns. And on the Democratic side, we talked about this a week ago, practically no significant money spent on negative ads, and voters got to decide who they wanted. So they watched all these ads, they read these mailers, they looked at their digital, they watched, hopefully, two very, very long debates where the candidates got to go up against each other, and they made this decision. They picked who they liked best without being sort of pressured into it by, again, this is the Andy Kim, Zahid Qureshi influence here. They got to make up their own minds without being told who they're taking.
I mean, I think there were a couple of towns where they were told fairly explicitly. And so you see in places like Union City where the party machinery is really strong. I mean, that was, Brian Stack delivered Union City for Mikey Sherrill. There are other towns, I think I was looking at Perth Amboy was very strong for Sherrill. A few other towns where Sherrill wouldn't have any obvious ins, but clearly the machinery was kind of working in her favor. I think the thing that is more sort of auspicious for her campaign is that in places where no one was pushing especially hard, hers was the message that just ended up being the most convincing to the most voters. Yeah. And then, so going back to your whole point about 47, 48% of the electorate kind of fits, at least in terms of their vote choice, into this maybe more progressive lane. I do think that, and I'll sort of repeat what other people have said here, but with a transition onto the Republican side, I do think that any kind of attempt to interpret statewide electorates that way in sort of these ideological lenses is going to miss a lot of the complexity of how voters treat the race. And my example for that is that if you were looking at the 2021 Republican primary, you would look at Jack Chitterelli winning 49.5% of the vote against three challengers, mostly two challengers, Phil Rizzo and Hirsch Singh, who were running very conservative and also, frankly, kind of amateurish. They were not the best campaigns ever, but very conservative campaigns saying, Jack isn't MAGA enough. We're true pro-Trumpers. New Jersey needs true conservative leadership on this issue and that issue and vaccines and COVID and abortion and gay rights and whatever. You would look at that and think, well, that seems like, the Jack Chitterelli wing of the party is maybe around half the state Republican electorate, and the sort of to the right of Jack Chitterelli wing of the party is around 50% of the state electorate. And then you would go into this year with a much stronger anti-Chitterelli candidate in Bill Spadia and think that's dangerous. And you look at John Bramnick potentially taking away more moderate votes from Chitterelli and say that's even more dangerous. And then that's not how it played out at all. Voters just reacted to the race entirely differently. Chitterelli ran a different campaign, to be sure. He ran a much more obviously pro-Trump campaign. But, if we were going off of the baseline from 2021 of the 50% MAGA and the 50% Chitterelli, that was just fundamentally the wrong frame to go into this year. So I would be cautious about taking the frame from this year's Democratic primary and taking it into any future elections and saying, this is approximately what the breakdown is.
And to sort of build off Joey's point there, if you look at this year's results, the strongest correlation that we're starting to see in the GOP primary isn't related to ideology or geography or county endorsements, but it really looks like Chitterelli did worst and Spadia did best in areas where Spadia's radio show were just broadcast. I forget who put that on Twitter, but there's a very clear relationship between the strength of Spadia's radio signal and how well he did in that area. And so even spending millions, a lot of times it didn't come down to ideology.
It was Noah Wyhoff-Rudnick, who is one of the election Twitter originals, who I remember from 2018 coverage. Those were different days.
We should also say that in 3 of those pink instead of dark red counties, Chitterelli was still 2-1 ahead. Somerset, Union, and Middlesex. It was only Hunterdon where Chitterelli was 52-39, and in Mercer where he was 48-41. So yes, they were pink, but 3 of them were almost, really almost, I think, miscolored. Really, when you're talking about 60-30, that's pretty red. That's pretty ruby red. So it was really only Mercer and Hunterdon where he got even close, I think.
Right.
And I mean,
that
he does
kind
live
of,
in Mercer County. He's a Princeton guy. So
he is Princeton, and that ties into, in the pre-primary show, I asked what we were looking at in the primary. I said I was going to be watching if Jack Chitterelli could win all 21 counties, including Ocean County. And it ended up not being very close. He won all 21 counties convincingly, especially Ocean County, which, despite George Gilmore backing Bill Spadia, it looks like Jack Chitterelli beat him by 40 percentage points, I think was about the last number.
So let me ask everybody a question. I mean, I don't think there's anybody here who's going to say that Donald Trump's endorsement of Jack Chitterelli wasn't significant. Now we see that Chitterelli won that nomination the night that Donald Trump made the endorsement, and we should talk later on about how that happened and the skill of the Chitterelli campaign and kitchen table conservatives and how they brought Donald Trump on board to support somebody who didn't say very nice things about him in 16 and 20. That in itself is I think I'd make the Chitterelli campaign clinches one of the best campaigns in the state just for pulling that off. But I want to ask a question of everybody, which is we see Chitterelli's numbers, 68%. We look at, no bad news anywhere for Jack Chitterelli. These are just extraordinary numbers up and down New Jersey. It doesn't matter where, Ryan, maybe but I don't know. I don't know if there's any, I don't know what towns Spadia actually won. And I think, did Bramnick win Westfield? We don't know because we don't have the Union County numbers, but it's possible. But the question is this: had Chitterelli, I think Chitterelli would have won had Trump not endorsed at all.
Yeah.
But if Spadia had been able to pull off a Trump endorsement, what do you guys think this race might have looked like?
I think it's a little bit of an impossible question because the conditions by the time.
I don't want to ask you easy questions, Joey.
Well, I'm rejecting the premise a little bit because by the time we got to the stage of the race where Trump was endorsing Chitterelli, it would have been hard to see Trump endorsing Spadia instead. So I mean, this is I'm writing a story partially about this right now. I'll workshop this line here where Trump didn't deliver Chitterelli the win, but he did help Chitterelli deliver the landslide. Where I don't think that a world where Trump remained neutral, things would have been this sort of convincing. I think that Chitterelli would have had a bit more work to do to kind of make sure he got over the hump. I think that Spadia's campaign wouldn't have been sort of deprived of oxygen for the last month in nearly the same way. But a big part of the reason why Trump endorsed Chitterelli in the first place is because he wanted to back a winner. And Chitterelli's campaign made the very successful, the very convincing argument to the Trump team that Chitterelli was a winner. They could say both, look at these primary polls. Bill Spadia is 30 points behind. Like if you really want to sort of hitch yourself to that wagon, that's gonna be a heavy lift. If you want to come out with a W on that. And B, look back at 2021. Donald Trump made fun of Chitterelli for not winning, but realistically, Chitterelli ran a great race that year, and maybe came as close as anybody reasonably could have. So. That was a really compelling argument to the Trump team. And the fact that Chitterelli won after the Trump endorsement is more like where it's flipped, where the Trump endorsement came because Chitterelli was winning and because Chitterelli sort of said the right things and did the right things and made himself the right candidate. And the narrative of the race was already so set by the time that kind of decision tree formed, that I don't even see a Spadia endorsement being all that realistic.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that Trump climbed on the Chitterelli bandwagon once he had a poll. This is Spadia said he endorsed a poll, right? Chitterelli was 40 points ahead in that poll, and he came out 40 plus points ahead in the election. So I don't know that you can say that Trump made the difference when that was the state of the race before his endorsement, and it was the state of the race after his endorsement. I think that what Trump's endorsement did was it closed the door on any possible option that Spadia might have. It starved him of oxygen, all of that. It shut things down. It froze the race where it was with 40 points ahead.
And as I said this last week too, Chitterelli has been running since November of 2021. So a lot of Republican voters have already had this idea in his head that he was already going to be the 2025 nominee based on what happened with the close race in 2021. So I kind of agree with everyone. I don't think it would have made a huge difference personally.
Yeah, people remember him and like him. I mean, we were talking before about how people remember and like Spadia from his radio show. And that certainly seems to have been the reasoning for a few people voting for him, especially kind of in his home turf. But a much larger portion of the state, the vast majority of people who voted in Tuesday's Republican primary probably also voted in the 2021 general election. Most of the people who didn't, just given how, sort of committed primary voters usually are, those are people who are probably turning out in general elections. There might be a few who are too young. There might be a few who recently moved into the state. But for the most part, these are people who remember Jack Chitterelli as the guy who took on Phil Murphy, the guy who took on mask mandates, the guy who almost upset the Democratic establishment. That's like, regardless of his individual issue positions, he was the guy who was fighting for them. And that's a really, really valuable thing to have. Getting the nomination for one race will make you into kind of the good guy for your party from then on out. And that's something that you are definitely able to capitalize on. I think we saw in a couple of races down ballot that it didn't necessarily work. I think we were thinking that Frank Pallotta in his assembly race might be able to bank on that, and that didn't really click. There were a few other congressional candidates who had mixed track records, some won, some lost. But it's that 2021 run, the 2017 run set up the 2021 run really well, and now the 2021 run has set up the 2025 run. The question is whether he can actually, get across the finish line against Mikey Sherrill now.
I would say had he got his butt kicked by Murphy in 2021 and wasn't a close race, it might have been more of an uphill battle for him this primary season. Yeah, but it wasn't. So
I had the same instinct you did, David. I wanted to see if Spadia had won any towns in Ocean County specifically, because that was the one we were all waiting to see. And if Spadia had a chance anywhere, it was going to be there. He didn't. He didn't win a single community there. He did win 20 election districts out of 421 election districts. So Chitterelli won 400 election districts in Ocean County.
Yeah, and you got it among the things, look, the Chitterelli campaign, that whole team led by Eric Arpert, and I should say too, not only so Chitterelli has been running for 9 years, and Arpert's been doing this for almost 6, and you've had, Florio won on his third try, but he didn't have the same team every time. I mean, this is, you've got people that have run a gubernatorial race before. It's really hard to find a flaw in the way Chitterelli ran this race. It was on all cylinders, and the numbers don't lie. And 6, to win a statewide primary by 46 points it's just impressive. There's no way around it. To see that, and that's how he did it. He didn't stop going. He showed up everywhere. He didn't write off Ocean County because, remember, the Chitterelli people played in that county chairman's race. They tried to stop George Gilmore from getting the chairmanship, and they didn't, and they still kept going there, and they had friends in Ocean County, and they kept that going, and he sort of built his own county organization there. So, it's just like, I don't know that I've ever really said that about a campaign. That's just sort of flawless in a statewide primary. But there's no mistakes. If you made it, you just did it right, and there weren't a lot of votes left for Bill Spadea or John Bramnick to go for. And the other two, Kranjak got it was less than 3% of the vote. Mario, I'm glad you didn't put your own money into this race, because you saved a bunch of money. And at the end of the day, if you don't have any money and you can't go on TV and you can't do all the digital stuff, and all you have is some campaign guys that are just getting mean on social media, but they're not reaching real voters, where you wind up is just a point better than a guy who spent the weekend before the election in jail for not paying child support. The lesson there is you've got to have if you're going to run statewide, you've got to have the resources to run a 21 county strategy. And I think that's one of the many, many takeaways of this election.
Well, you've just articulated why he's going to be such a tough general election opponent. This is not somebody who's running for the first time. This is not Curtis Bashaw. This is somebody who, his arguments are polished. He knows the people he's talking to. He has been to the chicken dinners every year for the last 9 years. He is hitting the ground running. He is somebody who's been at this a long time. He is comfortable with his staff. There's a lot to be said for, this enormous advantage of having been at this so long.
I will say
it contrasts.
Zach, go.
I think it contrasts interestingly too with Mikey Sherrill's campaign, who, we all knew she was running before January, or I forget which month she launched exactly, but we all knew she was running before November. Okay, yeah. But we all knew she was running before that. But she technically only had 7 months or so to actually run a campaign with ELEC and everything. Meanwhile, Chitterelli has been doing it pretty much since the night he lost in 2021, and they both succeeded in their own ways. Chitterelli just by dominating, and Cheryl with, as we talked about before, her Broadway profile and just other successes. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to tell it quick. I'm going
to actually jump in now, because
go ahead. Go ahead.
Just in terms of talking about the November general election, I do think that Chitterelli has created some amount of risk for himself, and this is something that people were talking about in 2021, and then he ended up overperforming anyway. So who knows how much it really is. But this sort of calculated pro-Trump campaign that's different from his more neutral campaign in 2021 and his more explicitly sort of anti-Trump views in 2017. New Jersey is still a blue-leaning state in presidential elections, less so in 2024 than in past ones, but it still voted for Kamala Harris. The state's voters on net are more anti-Trump than they are pro-Trump, at least when it comes to actually, voting in presidential elections. So I think that this was I agree with you completely, David. This was a flawless primary campaign to deliver a primary win. I do think that in the hypothetical scenario where we get to November and Mikey Sherrill wins by whatever it is, 10 points, 12 points, I don't think that's, is that the most likely outcome? I have no idea. Is that a possible outcome? Sure. Yeah. Then I think in retrospect, people are going to look back on this primary and say, well, yeah, it was great that he could defeat Bill Spadea like that. But, he ended up sort of becoming this different politician than he had been in his prior runs. And that, sort of put him out on a limb that he wasn't fully able to come back from. This is all speculative, to be clear. I'm not criticizing him for something that hasn't happened yet, but I'm just saying that this is, I can already see the ways in which this sort of becomes, in retrospect, the decision that led down this path of, he's now tied to a president and a political platform that New Jersey is not necessarily going to be on board with in November.
And, one of the things I love about the New Jersey Globe and, in our relationship with Ryder is that we don't all walk lockstep with each other. We all have our own opinions, and that is that's allowed at the New Jersey Globe. And for for people who have known me for 40, 50 years in around politics, they were a little surprised that at this stage in my life I've become so open-minded and permitting of dissent. So with that, Joey, I would respectfully disagree with you.
It was so passive-aggressive. What the hell was that? Oh my God.
But the reason that I think you're wrong, and you know how smart I think you are, but the reason I don't agree is Mikey Sherrill and the Democratic Party are going to tag Jack Ciattarelli with being pro-Trump, even if he wasn't pro-Trump, even if he didn't mention Trump's name. We saw this in 21 when Ciattarelli was not a Trump guy and Trump was out of the White House and Ciattarelli was still disagreeing with him. And Phil Murphy's campaign spent, a couple $1 million defining Jack Ciattarelli as a pro-Trump guy because the polls said that would work, and I don't doubt that. And I love Jarrell Harvey, who was the comms director of the Murphy campaign in 21. But as Ciattarelli sort of said, if I could have, if I took a shot every time Jarrell mentioned Trump in a call about Ciattarelli, then I wouldn't, I'd be ending my day a lot earlier. They're going to tag him that way anyway. And by the way,
I think voters will treat it differently if they think that it's a realistic way to tag him. I think that part of the reason that Murphy line didn't fully click in 2021 is that people would see that on an ad and then look at Ciattarelli in a debate or look at Ciattarelli's own messaging and say, these aren't really matching up. It's not like Jack Ciattarelli is out there saying like, oh boy, do I love Donald Trump. And so the voters aren't necessarily sort of like, the Phil Murphy messaging is only one input that's coming in and it's not the one that's fully sinking in. I think that you could say the same thing about the Democratic field this time, where, no matter who the Democratic nominee was, it could have been Micah Sherrill, it could have been Ras Baraka, it could have been Josh Gottheimer. The Republican Party would have undoubtedly said, these are, radical tax and spend liberals who will just continue the Phil Murphy agenda. Jack Ciattarelli is probably going to leave it at that. Some of the national groups that like to get pissier are probably going to call them communists or something like that. But the question is, are voters going to believe that more about Ras Baraka or Josh Gottheimer? They're not dumb. They can sort of figure out the difference when someone is attacking their opponent for sort of a realistic hit versus something that is in fact really far from reality. So when Ciattarelli brings the sort of Trump tag closer to reality, there could be sort of a critical group of voters who will now be more receptive to that argument than they sure under the old Jack Ciattarelli.
There's even an argument to be made that the Sherrill campaign could be very clever in saying, Jack used to know better. He used to be more Jersey. He used to discern the difference. He sold out for political expediency, right? So there's a way to I think talk about the formerly more reasonable position that doesn't exist anymore, where you almost could account for that difference. And we'll see if that's where they go or that's where they don't go. But of course, the real elephant in the room is that maybe his numbers won't be tanked in the fall. Maybe the economy won't be tanked in the fall. I think for both campaigns, what's interesting to me is that there's a certain element here that is out of the control of either one of them at this point, whether or not Trump is going to be a foil or whether he's going to be an asset.
They have to kind of run the best state level campaign they possibly can, and then just make sure that they're sort of nimble enough to adjust around whatever national stuff is going on. And it may be that the national stuff gets so intense that one of them, more likely, given that Republicans are currently in control, more likely it would be that Ciattarelli would be suffering because of this. The national stuff gets sort of just too all-encompassing for anyone of their party to win.
Well, it's just funny because we're supposed to have odd-year gubernatorial elections to take the national influence out of this. Yeah, we're talking about the national influence. So, yeah.
Yeah, and these, the 1947, modern day founding fathers. This is exactly what they debated this. They discussed. We want, because Jersey used to have 3-year terms. So every 12 years, you had a governor elected in a presidential year with a U.S. senator on the ballot. And and it was an entirely, they ping pong back and forth in the kind of races. This is exactly what wasn't supposed to happen, and it's happened anyway. And you sort of wonder if you're going to get tagged with national politics, why not just move them to an even year and simplify it for voters. But I agree with you, Mike.
Get higher turnout. I'm sorry.
And we saw state assembly candidates this year running on standing up to Trump. I mean, it's just it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. No one can really escape it at this point.
David,
no, the number. I mean, I saw candidates for borough council in small towns saying, elect me to the borough council and I will stand up to Donald Trump. And I don't know what that means. It's just, I guess they see everybody else doing it and they're saying, well, this is what I should do. Micah, I agree with you 100% that elections are a snapshot in time. And from the third week of September until Election Day, when the vote by mail ballots go out, and Ryan said people were voting earlier. So this campaign, you can't wait till Labor Day anymore because people are going to vote very, very soon on it. And by the way, one thing about Chitterelli and Sherrill is it's not in either of their natures to take their foot off the gas. And by the way, I'd say that about every major candidate that was in this field for both parties. So we're going to get that
June
anyway.
June 11th, Jack Chitterelli, I think Eric Harper, they had at least 4 events that press could go to, and I think 6 more. They hit all over the state the day after the primary without much sleep. But also, it's.
I'm sure you were so happy that he had those, Zach. I'm sure you were thrilled.
I was really happy to be there. I was glad they had me. But to speak of the ubiquity of Trump, as we're talking about this, Jack Chitterelli a minute ago tweets out a message that he received from the president. And it looks like Trump printed out the results of Jack Chitterelli winning the primary and then signed it with his Sharpie and said, "Jack, great job," and then just gave his prototypical, it's not going to work on there at all. But he's around.
Jack's not distancing himself yet.
He's not. And this, by the way, there's lots of different factors here. What we don't know yet is how much independent spending is going to come into New Jersey from the Republican side. Remember, they didn't help him at all in 21. Chris Christie called and anybody who had on their, anybody who had the pool, it took me till 9:12 to say Chris Christie, but Chris Christie told the RGA that Chitterelli can't win, don't bother, don't play here. And they didn't do anything to help Jack Chitterelli 4 years ago. And he came within 3 points without them. So what we don't know, we know that we're going to see a lot of outside spending for Mikey Sherrill. These Trump ties, and they clearly come with a risk. There's no doubt about that. But how much money is going to come into Jersey to talk about, the same themes that Chitterelli thinks can win him the election? How much money are they going to spend? Or are Republicans going to be able to level, sort of level the financial playing field because of those Trump ties? So, it's and I don't know the answer to that. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see if Trump is really going to push people to spend, millions and millions and millions of dollars of independent expenditures.
It's notable that Mikey Sherrill's close friend Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, people at least right now are sort of treating that like a bit of an easier Democratic lift than New Jersey. You might see outside spending in both, but it's definitely a very different situation from 2021, where both parties were really deeply invested in Virginia, and that became like this enormous race. And New Jersey was sort of the sidecar, and then they ended up being almost as close as one another. This time, in the 2024 presidential election, New Jersey and Virginia were about as blue as one another, and the tenor of which race is sort of the one to really watch has definitely shifted. So that could if you treat sort of outside money on both sides, but especially on the Republican side, as sort of a finite resource, there might be less competition for it this year.
And great. By the way, just quickly, because people who are watching, this are sort of uber political junkies. Mikey Sherrill and Abigail Spanberger are incredibly close friends. They met during while they were both running for Congress for the first time in 2018. They were part of this national security class of veterans and White House and CIA analysts who all got elected to Congress that year. Mikey Sherrill, and this is extremely common in D.C., where people just sort of need a place to sleep at night. They were housemates. They shared a house together in Washington while they were both in Congress. And now it's possible that they could both be governors together, and just because everything revolves around Jersey, Mikey Sherrill grew up in Virginia, and Abigail Spanberger was born in Red Bank, and still has family in Monmouth County. So it's just it's just a great story of these two women who were major party nominees for governor in the only gubernatorial races in the country, and they are really close friends.
This lets me bring up my favorite Mikey Sherrill family connection. I forget if I've ever said it on one of these live streams before, that she went to the same high school as my mom in Virginia, and then my dad was born in her congressional district. So she is the true avatar of my parents coming together from different parts of the world.
On that note, can we move to the assembly? Are we good?
Yeah.
On that note.
And I don't think we have to do the whole 40 districts. Do we want to do it by region?
I think we should just do it by what races we're interested in. What race are you most
how about
interested
that? All right, go ahead, Joey. Start us off.
No, you. What race did you come out of election night being the single most interested in?
Oh, single most, boy, that's a tough one. I mean, I always think of home, so I always think of the South, and I was very interested in the fact that one of the Fulop running mates, Weeks in the 2nd district, is within a hair's breadth of defeating the organization there, the regular organization, and he not only had the support of Fulop, interestingly, but he had the support of Smalls as well. And so this was the mayor. And so this was a very interesting race. And we'll see what winds up being the case. I don't know if anybody has newer numbers than what I just saw, but again, he's pretty close there.
There was also another South Jersey race, the 7th district, where, and I don't have the numbers up right in front of me either, but that's another Fulop running mate, Bordentown Mayor Eric Holliday, who was not a campaign that, I mean, like any of the sitting politicians who were running on the Fulop slate, I think people were sort of at least somewhat paying attention to it, but it definitely was not one of the races that felt like it was sort of the thing on election day. And then he came quite close as well.
Yeah, but that's a really interesting district in the sense that, first of all, the number of votes that Carol Murphy got as compared to the other two really makes it look as though she got all the other votes from each of the two candidates, Balfour Singh and the mayor of Bordentown, and she this is a year after the congressional primary. Carol Murphy wins. I was looking through it, I may be wrong, but I think Carol Murphy got more votes than any other assembly candidate in the state. And that includes Brian Stack's assembly candidate. That's pretty good. And I think one of the takeaways here is no lines, and you had a mayor. You had, a mayor who was a former police officer, a certain draw there. The takeaway when we start looking through some of these numbers is a difference between, we can't call them off the line anymore, but the non-organization challengers on an office block ballot where they're not lost, who have their own base, who have run for office before, who sort of know what to do, are doing better. Joey, you talked about Brittany Claybrooks. She was a former East Orange City Councilwoman. She ran for Congress last year. She didn't do great, but she ran and she spent, she was out there campaigning in part of which was the footprint of this legislative district. Weeks in Atlantic City as a former Atlantic City councilman. So there's a difference, a noticeable difference in these assembly primaries when you have somebody who's running and they're a known entity, as opposed to somebody who's been, it was willing to put their name on the ballot, but had no name ID, had no base, had no real understanding of what it's like to go out and campaign. And I think you're seeing that there, and those are where it was closest. And then, you get a district like the 20th with Ed Rodriguez. He may not have been in elective office, but he was he was sort of a member of Mayor Bolwich's cabinet. He had been, a director in the city of Elizabeth, and had that little bit of a base there, and I think he won Union Township by a fairly significant number, and they had a higher turnout. And then you start looking at districts in Hudson County, which we already talked about, but Jerry Walker, who won an assembly race and an incumbent lost in that primary. Jerry Walker, is a county commissioner, also ran for Congress last year in that special for Don Payne's seat. But he had that, and Ravi Bala had spent, couple $1 million running for Congress last year, and was mayor of Hoboken for 2 terms, and on the council for a bunch of terms. And I think going forward, that might be sort of the what's the secret sauce when there's no lines. It's going to be better candidates who have a base and an ability to raise a little bit money, and people know them.
So I want to mention
Zach.
You mentioned Ravi Bala, the other winner in the 32nd district, and David, you said earlier that Jack Citarelli ran one of the best campaigns in the state. I think Katie Brennan will also be in that conversation of one of the strongest campaigns in the state. She went up against an incumbent assembly member. Her running mate, obviously, Ravi Bala, the mayor of Hoboken. She went up against a Jersey City councilman. She went up against 2 party-backed candidates. And in all of that chaos, she had never really run for office in this area before. She managed to win. She came first place. And she did it as an independent candidate. She ran some really professional advertisements and really seemed to have a strong ground game and a strong team with people like Louis DiPaolo. Louis DiPaolo, I apologize, but that she's looking to be one of the stars to come out of this.
Yeah, and
I was curious.
Go ahead, Joey. And then we'll say.
I just because I had forgotten to check this until just now. Like, is this a situation where she was listed first on the ballot, and so a lot of voters just sort of not accustomed to the new ballots kind of flowed to her? No, she was listed 5th. Voters had to really specifically find her, and they did really successfully. I think that, in the sort of pre-election consensus was a little bit that Bala, as the mayor of, about a third of the district and someone who just ran for Congress and won the precincts in the election districts in this district by a lot, seemed like he was, the at least soft front runner for one seat. And then the other seat was sort of a pileup. I definitely did not have Brennan is the safer one and Bala is the one who has to fight for the seat as kind of being on my bingo card. But yeah, I mean, something really clicked with her campaign. This is something that's been kind of building up in this part of the state for a while in downtown Jersey City and Ward E and Hoboken. And sort of the progressive activists who are all part of the same orbit have been frustrated for a while. And this was a major breakthrough. And then there's going to be municipal elections in Hoboken and Jersey City this November, where I think we'll see sort of how to what extent that energy continues.
Well, don't forget that we talked about how highly informed and how different regions pay a lot of attention. We shouldn't forget that among progressives, among primary Democrats, Katie Brennan, not for the most wonderful of reasons, has a high profile and had a high profile for a long time during the Murphy years, and that was related to the sexual assault incident. And so she was a well-known quantity. And David, you talked about having to have a way to become known. Never really want to make any comparison to anybody else, but this is sort of like when a member of Congress was a victim of violence or sexual assault or of something else, right? This is what brought them into the politics and into people's awareness and consciousness. And something has to do that in the post-line environment. And that seems to be part of her narrative and part of what people first knew about her.
And one of the things that, and we should make no mistake, these are safe Democratic seats. So Katie Brennan is going to be a member of the state assembly in January. And I'm sure there's a lot of legislators that are going to envy the fact that she got there on her own terms and she really doesn't owe anybody. She's not controlled by anybody, and she can go down there and she can do what she wants the way she wants to do it. And that is, number one, that's unusual. Number two, and I'm saying this now third or fourth time, that's sort of what Andy Kim and Judge Quarashi and Sue Altman and the Working Families group, when they started this whole thing a few years ago and brought the lawsuit, this is exactly what they had in mind, is somebody like Katie Brennan could enter the race, run a good campaign, work hard, have an equal shot of other candidates of winning, and go to Trenton without owing anybody and being in anybody's debt. And this 32nd district, her maybe more than any of the others in the state is sort of this, this was the intention, and this might be what spurs others into following suit and running for the legislature down the road. One other point that I want to, there are two other points, but I want to say that Barbara McCann Stamato in the 31st and Jessica Ramirez in the 32nd, both freshman assemblywomen. You sort of wonder how history is going to record this, and people will look at old ballots and they'll say, well, they used to be Hudson County Democratic Organization, and then others were in the primary that they lost. Barbara Stamato and Jessica Ramirez did not get dumped by the party. They were, the circumstances of their allegiances. They were both Fulop allies, and they chose to stand at with Steve Fulop. And you've got to in a way admire that also. Both of them had an opportunity to flip. Both of them were given the chance to have party support for re-election if they weren't running on the Fulop line, and they both showed tremendous loyalty. People who know Barbara McCann Stamato, who's been doing this for a long time, that's not really any great surprise at all. That's sort of who she is. She is a loyal person, and it's just important to show that they weren't dumped. And the other one that's worthy of just I could go hours myself, Joey. I promise I won't. But in the 33rd, where the Sacco machine and Tony Hector, who's a landlord who hasn't necessarily appreciated Brian Stack's staunch pro-tenant positions, decided to throw his own money into that race, and it didn't matter, and Stack just just demolished them. But what's happening now is Larry Weinstein, who I think I mentioned last time, who is Hispanic, from North Bergen, who ran against Nick Sacco 3 times. for local office and got about a third of the vote. Now he's going to be an assemblyman, and he gets to potentially become a greater a greater influence in North Bergen, and I think he put about $400,000 of his own money into this race. So you're going to see more of that, and for people who've been around the politics for a long time, Hudson County has this tradition of the gadflies become the bosses. Even Steve Fulop, who had started out as running against Bob Menendez in a congressional primary, and then got himself a council seat. Or Albio Sirius, I think, ran 4 times in West New York for local office before he finally won there. Stack got sidelined and dumped and pushed out of the way. So now you've got Larry Weinstein, and you might be looking at sort of an end of this Sacco regime, which is fairly significant.
There was one other race in South Jersey. I know we have a lot more in North Jersey to talk about, but the 8th district was one that I found interesting because we're going to have this rematch. Anthony Angelozzi defeated a Fulop candidate, a person on the Fulop slate, Eddie Freeman. He is a former Evesham councilman. This is somebody who fits that mold that we talked about, who runs in their own right and develops their own reputation and has their own record. And it didn't work out in his case. He got 19% of the vote. Angelozzi got significantly more, 33% of the vote. He took nothing for granted the way that he did 2 years ago. So he and Andrea Katz will be running mates again. This time they'll be running against Brandon Umba and Assemblyman Teresi. So that was an interesting one in the other half of the Burlington. We talked about the other half, the 7th district. This is the other half of Burlington County,
which is basically how politics works everywhere else. Is sure, you can be a sitting councilman or state legislator or whatever, but if you don't have the argument, or you just don't have the campaign prowess, or something goes wrong with your campaign. I'm not casting aspersions on Eddie Freeman specifically or anyone in New Jersey, but there are campaigns that work and there are campaigns that don't. And New Jersey had always just kind of glided right through that. Like, we could take any candidate and elect him to the state assembly. It doesn't really matter what exactly we do. And now we're starting to see, no, the incumbents have to run real campaigns. And also the people who want to unseat the incumbents, or the people who want to beat the party, have to run real campaigns too. Everyone has to work for it. And that's sort of, that's the new status quo. And David, to your point about Katie Brennan being this kind of unaligned assembly member in this really unusual way. I mean, this is something that the state legislature does not currently have any members who got there without party support. So having, Katie Brennan, Robbie Bala, maybe Ed Rodriguez, and then the other candidate that I want to bring up, Kenyatta Stewart in the 35th district, that was definitely an unusual race. It played out on sort of strange lines, where it's a district with sort of big ethnic communities from several different groups, where it's a Hispanic majority district, but there's also a big Black community and a big Muslim community, especially Palestinian Americans. And you had an assembly race that kind of broke down along that, where you had a Black candidate, a Palestinian American candidate, and 2 Latino candidates running on various different slates. But Kenyatta Stewart ended up coming in first place. It ended up being the 2 party-back candidates, Al Abdelaziz and Orlando Cruz, who were duking it out for number 2. And Abdelaziz, we called that race, right? Yeah. Abdelaziz ended up winning by a little bit, which will have sort of the unfortunate side effect, no shade to that candidate specifically, but unfortunate side effect of making this plurality or majority Hispanic district have 0 Hispanic representatives because of the way that the votes shook out. But Kenyatta Stewart is also someone who got there almost entirely of his own volition. He is allied with Ras Baraka. He's the Newark Corporation Council, but that's not the machine in Patterson. That's a whole different thing. He has his own kind of operation there. Ras Baraka won Patterson by a lot. That definitely helped. And the Black community really turned out. That definitely helped Stewart. And he gets to the assembly as this sort of unusual hybrid candidate, where he ran without any particular ticket or party support. He has this sort of Baraka backing, but Baraka's got his own thing in his own area. And who knows what Baraka's future exactly is going to be. The post-gubernatorial primary, is he going to stay in the mayor's office? Is he going to be on the lieutenant governor shortlist? We'll see. But that's someone else who will get to the assembly, and there is going to be no party leader, at least at the start, whispering over their shoulder saying, oh yeah, like vote for this bill, or oh yeah, introduce that, or no, we actually don't want you to say that. Right now, kind of every legislator has to at least worry about that a little bit. There's someone who kind of can tap on their shoulder and say, okay, time to do something now. And there will be this sort of little core of new legislators in 2026 for whom that just won't be true. And I don't think that we have sort of a clear framework for that yet. And it'll be interesting to see how they do it.
Yeah. I mean, in 35, I mean, and this is, what's old is new again. Kenyatta Stewart brought in Al Spivey to sort of run that ground operation. He's the guy who ran the Pascrell ground operation in 2012 in that primary against Rothman that Bill Pascrell wasn't supposed to win. So Stewart ran a really good, savvy campaign. I think he probably had more help from people who publicly endorsed the organization-backed candidates than they're ready to admit at this point. But he got there, and he's, this is now sort of expanding this Baraka footprint a little bit. Also, I think you're going to see, Kenyatta Stewart. This is a significant person. This isn't just some neophyte. He's been thinking about running for office for years. People have been talking about him for mayor the last couple of times, and he very carefully picked, when his time was, and it worked out really well for him.
I'm curious if this. One of the notable things is that most of the outsider candidates this assembly cycle were on that full-up slate, and I don't know how much of consideration there was done from progressive groups to actually try to do some of their own recruiting outside of full-ups. He made it part of his gubernatorial campaign, and that had its own benefits for him. But I wouldn't be surprised if going forward we see some of the big progressive groups in the state try to follow the Kenyatta Stewart, the Katie Brennan model, and it'll be harder in districts that don't have the same types of political activity. But there's a model here that I think this post-line world has shown us to be able to work.
Yeah,
it's notable that the Working Families Party, which sort of, it's certainly not the only progressive group in the state, but if you're sort of thinking about state progressive group that makes endorsements, that's sort of the first one that comes to mind. Right. Endorsed a lot of members of Fulop slate, but they didn't endorse Steve Fulop. They endorsed Ras Baraka for governor. So as we were talking about at length before, the progressive vote was not a monolith here. And in at least two cases, they endorsed county party backed candidates. They endorsed Chigozie Onyema. I don't know if we've brought up that primary yet, but where Garnett Hall lost re-election. That was sort of, there were two incumbents and then an insurgent coming in Onyema, and the party decided to get behind the insurgent, sort of preempting any kind of challenge. And he became the sort of hybrid candidate of both the party establishment and, he ran against a Baraka candidate in Newark, a Newark council race in 2022. He had the Working Families endorsement. He straddles both lanes there. And then I know that the WFP also endorsed Alex Nkayazos Gill. They may have endorsed other incumbents too, and I'm just forgetting it. But so, this is not something where the progressive energy and the Fulop energy was all perfectly aligned. In some cases, there was a bit of a mismatch. And in 2027, when only the legislature will be on the ballot, legislative challengers and the groups that endorse them will have a little bit less oxygen, maybe because there's not a governor's race that's also, bringing voters out to the polls, but they also will have sort of an easier political balancing act to pull off, because it's just, I want to run for legislature. I am running for legislature. I'm running for the seat. Support me. That's all the argument you need.
And they can put all their resources into just legislative races instead of trying to prop up a eventually doomed gubernatorial candidate.
Yeah. One of the things that surprised me in the 28th is that it looks like Cleopatra Tucker was the top vote getter. I'm sure that is directly related to Baraka pumping out, turnout in the Newark portion of that district. And Ryan, I'm going to ask you about turnout in, how the 28th went in terms of turnout in Newark, which has been notoriously low in recent years, and versus South Orange and Maplewood, which are high information active voters. But Onyema is and again he chose to run, and he didn't know if he didn't know where the organization was necessarily going. But you're talking about if you look at 3 young freshman legislators who will most certainly be there in January: Katie Brennan, Kenyatta Stewart, Chigozie Onyema. This is you're sort of forming this block here of people that are not dependent upon others. There's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm among some insiders for how this guy's gonna perform, and I made my issues, my thoughts about what happened to an incumbent, known. I don't have to rehash it. Other than the fact that, and this isn't a swipe at all at Steve Fulop, because Fulop really did a great job recruiting candidates. There would have been a whole less of these discussions if not for him. But even without the line, the only 3 incumbents who lost primaries were 3 that ran on the Fulop ticket. Nobody else lost. So in terms of without a line, party-backed candidates running for as incumbents didn't lose. But Joey, I have two questions out there for Ryan.
Ryan?
Go to Ryan first and tell me, and then I'm going to ask Joey something. But Ryan, tell me about the numbers in the 28th.
Yeah, I mean, so right now we're at 33,734 total votes for that race. That's a 200. I don't know all the assembly districts. I haven't had time to crunch all the assembly districts, but for this district specifically, it's a 233% increase compared to 2024, which was a federal primary. 2024 we saw.
Wait, is that accounting for the fact that this is an assembly race and therefore they would be double?
Well, yeah, because I doubled it. Yeah, so okay. So I said 14,000. If you double it as 28, and then we're looking at 33. So roughly 110%. That would be too good to be true. Yeah, I meant specific number of ballots cast, like when I meant individually. But so roughly 110% of 2020, and then advanced voting. I'm looking at now. Let's see, 5,448. Yeah, mail ballots cast is increased by 110% since 2024. Early voting has increased by 220% since 2024. So, as expected, all around the state, most assembly districts, or probably not if all, have exceeded 2024 expectations. What this has to do with the specific assembly candidates, we're not sure. It's really hard to tell. But compared to other districts, this district has exceeded 2024 by more than the statewide average. So that's good.
So tell me about turnout South Orange and Maplewood versus South and West Wards in Newark.
I do not have that granular data right now. I've not had time, to be honest.
Right, so we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So Joey, my question of you, and you and I talked about a little bit about this. Only 3 incumbents lost, but how many incumbents, could have lost? How many of them had unimpressive victories in primaries?
I don't have. Well, so first of all, I got a text. Al Abdelaziz was also endorsed by Working Families, so I think it was 3 party back where the party backing and the WFP backing overlapped. I don't have a number off the top of my head in terms of the number of incumbents who came close to losing. I mean, Balveer Singh in LD7, that was dangerous for him. Vicky Flynn in LD13, she won by a decent amount, but it was the kind of thing where that's a primary that probably with no lines in an earlier political context might have not really gone anywhere. Instead, Rich Castaldo came, a couple thousand votes away. Loretta Rivers, Piscataway Board of Education member in LD 17. That was sort of the district, and Zach has talked about this before too, where it was the most obviously fertile target, maybe outside of LD 32, the Katie Brennan district, the most obviously fertile district for a challenge, because it's this very progressive local district. I mean, it's got Piscataway, it's got New Brunswick, it's got Franklin Township, and it has 3 white male representatives, Bob Smith in the Senate, and then Joe Danielson and Kevin Egan in the Assembly. And Joe Danielson was the sort of public face and sponsor of the Open Public Records Act overhaul that passed the legislature and prompted a lot of sort of activist fury. And then the Loretta Rivers campaign, she was the only one running. She didn't have any running mates. And it didn't become sort of one of the premier primaries. And yet it was. We didn't really fully realize it, but it 100% was. She came quite close to unseating Danielson. He was ultimately saved by Franklin Township, where he is I think he's a former mayor, right, David?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he won by 535 votes.
Yeah. So that was big time dangerous and that's just sort of, speaking to the danger that the Middlesex Democrats have placed themselves in general by having these sort of demographically unrepresentative slates. This district that's, something like 75%, 78% non-white. And other incumbents that Shama Hyder and Ellen Park in LD 37 in Bergen County. Again, they weren't exactly close to losing. I think that the closest vote gap was about 3,000 votes, but they had challengers both from a full-up slate and from an unaligned slate, and all of them got not insignificant numbers of votes. McCann-Stamato, Hall, and Ramirez obviously lost. There was Sergio Granados is trailing right now. He's not an incumbent, but he's a party back guy. Orlando Cruz is not an incumbent in LD 35, but he's a party back guy. Am I missing anywhere? Oh, and what I was mentioning before, the Brittany Claybrooks versus Mike Venezia primary.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many that adds up to, but I mean, it's a fair number, and it's definitely a lot of incumbents have to now sort of worry, like, okay, that was sort of with, again, going up against a campaign that hadn't drawn a ton of attention, that wasn't able to raise a ton of money. What happens to me in 2 years if somebody looks at that result and says, oh yeah, I can do that, and I can also raise $100,000 for it? That's when things start to get really dicey.
I don't want to.
Go ahead, Jack.
I don't want to step on my reporting live coming out somewhat soon too much, but I talked with Brittany Claybrooks today, and we talked about the fundraising gap where Venezia and Morales raised and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. I forget the specific number, while Claybrooks was dealing with less than 15,000. And she talked about how that gap was just so hard to overcome, and if it had been a bit more even in the end, it could have worked out. And the same goes for Loretta Rivers, where together Egan and Danielson spent more north of $400,000, yeah, I believe that's right. I will double check later, but she spent about $10,000 to $15,000 in the race, and so I think this will be a lesson learned in terms of there are vulnerable candidates out there potentially, but money still matters.
I realized I did forget one before, which is Lou Greenwald and Melinda Kane had a not especially convincing victory over Becky Holloway in the sort of Cherry Hill-based district. That was another district that, I think that in retrospect, looking at some of the past stuff that the progressives have been able to do there, and the fact that Holloway did pretty decently in her county clerk run last year, that maybe should have been more on our radars, but it wasn't really. And that ended up being sort of, that's another warning sign, because that's the kind of district, unlike some of the others, that's a district where you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a huge clamoring for, sort of like a progressive insurgency. And yet 10,000 voters or something like that chose that anyways.
Yeah. And there were no, you had the organization, Camden County, Mikey Sherrill winning Camden County. It changed those numbers. You didn't really have the top of the ticket and the organization line that was bringing him through. I think that race, it probably different reasons, than the governor's race, but there are clearly people that without the line, without the preferential ballot position, without all that white area ballot Siberia, it changes the way voters look at things. I want to go back just quickly back to the 37th. And, it's hard when because they vote for two. It's not as simple as if it were a state Senate race and you can say, 57-43 or something like that. But, loosely, when you look at that Park-Hader combination, that's 48% of the vote, which means that, the other four split the votes there. That doesn't mean that if there were only two opponents that those two would have won, but it's a warning sign when the combined organization back, the winners are not over 50, and I think this is exactly the kind of district that you might see primaries again there.
I think there are times when you can look at a split, like, for example, one set of incumbents versus two set of challengers, right? That's where you can almost say, well, boy, if there was one set of challengers, the dynamic would have been different or could have been different, right? I think there are times when it's not ideological, when you can say things like that. I want to go back to two things. One thing, we talked about the impact of money and the difference between having $10,000 or $15,000. Kenyatta Stewart, when we looked at his next to last report, and we looked at Katie Brennan, they both had resources. They'd raised between $100,000 and $150,000 each, and we're able to look at that and they say, okay, you're not running necessarily even with the organization candidate, but you still have the ability to get some of your message out there somehow. And I think we've seen that's sort of a microcosm of what we've seen in races across the country. You don't necessarily need to go dollar for dollar, but you do need to be able to compete. And I think that was maybe a difference that we're going to see with some of the successful renegades who ran and won, is that they had some resources. The other thing, David, you asked about was turnout. Newark had just a hair's breadth under 15% turnout citywide. Maplewood was about double that at 30, and South Orange was about a little bit above that. They were in the low 30s, and so double or better.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. If I'm not mistaken, that's actually not terrible for Newark relative to.
No, it's not. That's right, especially compared to a school board race. Yeah. And that's why Baraka came out of Newark, with 14,000 votes. Yeah.
Right.
But you look at other places in the 16th district. The incumbents, Roy Fryman and Michelle Drulis, I mean, they crushed the challenger. Who also, I think those two campaigned, and look, Fryman is, he's a full-time legislator, and I need to be objective, but he's one of the most competent guys, down in Trenton, just smart and in it for the right reasons. And, voters in that kind of his district, Princeton and Somerset County, they I think they see that also. But there were a lot of fails, and by the way, some of the perennial candidates, in 18 and 19, they didn't get anywhere. So you sort of look, and even 2027, Rosie Bagoli and Alex and Colossos Gill, they easily dispatch pull-up candidates. So, you don't see those same percentages. I'm not sure, exactly what the reason is, other than, it's incumbents also who take these things seriously and who might just be better fits for their district than a guy like Joe Danielson. And I think one of the things you're going to see, one of the challenges for 27 is, that's a Middlesex district plus Franklin, and Middlesex in the line days allowed Somerset County to have one of those seats. And what wound up happening is in Franklin Township, Joe Danielson, a former mayor, did fine, but Kevin Egan did not. And so you've got to wonder, is Kevin McCabe going to sort of look at that and say, what the hell are we giving Somerset a seat for if they're not helping our guy? We'll just run our own campaign. So, you might between the fact that these three candidates are not, the incumbents are not necessarily representative of the demographics of the district, the fact that they didn't perform impressively, that they weren't helping each other, I think you're either going to see a need for a reset by the party, maybe, or you're going to see some more competitive primaries there.
I mean, maybe Somerset didn't do enough to help Kevin Egan out, but then Middlesex didn't do enough to help Joe Danielson out. He's in third there.
Yeah,
he lost to Loretta Rivers in Middlesex. And with your point about how LD 16 and LD 27 weren't close, and LD 18 and LD 19, but those perennial challengers, this is what we always knew would happen when the line went down. I think I said it on live streams exactly like this, that the line being struck down was step one in a many step process to sort of an insurgent candidate winning. I think that we as most of us are political journalists, in talking with candidates here all the time. I mean, every candidate who you get on the phone will tell you that they have a path to victory, and will tell you that the voters, whatever the endorsements are, whatever the money is, that the voters will hear their message and the voters will elect them. And, as a crutch for some of these candidates in the days of the line to say, well, the ballot is tilted against us. So of course that's, that's a fight that we're going to have. But now that the county line is gone, we're sort of seeing the wheat separate from the chaff here, where some candidates actually, have what it takes to run real campaigns, and some of them don't. Some of them they're running in the wrong district. They don't actually have the skills to do it. They don't actually have a message that will really resonate with anybody. And voters, just as they would in the line era, will say, well, what's the point of that? That's not anything in particular. Yeah. So it doesn't surprise me remotely that it surprises me in some cases which districts were the close ones and which ones were not. But it doesn't surprise me at all that the districts had a lot of stratification in terms of whether the voters took these challengers seriously or they didn't, because in many cases the challengers deserved to be taken seriously, and in many cases they didn't.
Yeah, and we should not assume that just because they're incumbents, voters knew they were incumbents.
Right.
We should almost assume that that incumbents who could no longer rely on the generosity of their county line and had to actually get those things that we call votes on their own. Not all of them were as able to do it as others, and maybe caught a little bit unprepared, and that'll play. I think that's going to play into the future too. The other thing, and I don't
wait, David, before you go on, just about that was why the legislature flirted with putting incumbency on the ballot, and we said, wait a minute, be careful, that cuts both ways.
Yeah. I got to tell you, I think that if they had done that, if they had put incumbency on the ballot, Loretta Rivers would have won, and I think you would have had a couple more like that. Micah, I remember when I broke that story that was a consideration, and you tweeted out a incumbents beware. Not everybody loves incumbents, and you may not want to have that scarlet letter there next to you. So I think that worked out. The other thing before we start to wind down, and by the way, this is just a guess. This is, I may be completely wrong, but we may have seen the effect also of a new law that raised the threshold of petition requirements, where you didn't have, it made it harder for really minor, not at all serious, nowhere close to being viable candidates not running, and that allowed some of the more serious challengers to not be competing with the others. And possible, for example, that if there were two other, what do they call them, phantom candidates, which we didn't have this year. We didn't have phantom candidates in the ballot, and in a lot of places, and and the result is, if you had them in the 17th, maybe Loretta Rivers wouldn't have come as close because she would have lost some of those votes.
Yeah, and I mean, a few Phillip challengers got caught in that dragnet during the petition challenge process, and you kind of wonder, like, maybe those were some of the challengers who would have emerged with, in fact, only 12% of the vote or whatever, but they didn't even put together enough of a campaign in time for the filing day for them to make it to the ballot successfully, and so we'll never actually get to that point with them.
That's a good point. I mean, when you think about, and again, I looked at these numbers. So, at the low end, there were some Phillip running mates who brought like maybe 5,000 votes to the table. At the high end, there were some who brought 10,000 more votes to the table. And so, it ran the full gamut in between.
You had in the 27th, and I'm just looking at these numbers. You had Rohit Dave, who was the Phillip candidate, and was on Phillip's literature and on his lawn signs, and on his mail, and then you have Michael Blake, and I apologize, still don't know who he is. I just wasn't really familiar with him, but he was not a Phillip candidate. He didn't have, not only did he not have money, but he also didn't have the in-kind contributions. And he got 59 votes more than the guy on the Phillip ticket.
And you don't and he was obscure enough that his name is in fact Blake Michael. I was
thinking,
really? When you said Michael Blake, I was like, that's a New York State assemblyman who's running for New York City mayor. I think that's a different guy.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So yeah, it's Blake Michael.
These two challengers being named Dave and Michael, their last names being Dave and Michael, all cycle long. It broke my brain. I still am not used to it. That's been.
Yeah, I mean it's. I don't know. I look at that and look, we could read a lot into it, and and there are some people who vote out of spite, and Micah, you and I have seen that for years. That there's a lot of people who will not vote for their nominee in the general because they know them and they don't like them, and those are elected officials who just have these grievances, but so there are certain people who just won't vote for incumbents, and but I don't know how to explain that. I don't know how to explain that. I almost called him George Michael, Blake Michael. I know. I mean, I just I don't know how Blake Michael got more votes than a guy who was part of a structured organization in a campaign, other than the fact that there are votes to be had for people running against incumbents, and that's it, because I think we were a little over where we wanted to be, so I'll stop.
I think Ryan has some closing thoughts. I'm sorry.
Well, just say really quick, back to the incumbency on the ballot. To my knowledge, Georgia is the only state that has incumbents listed as the incumbent on the ballot. So if New Jersey was going to pass that law, they'd be really just joining Georgia in that instance. So,
yeah. And by the way, when Judge Quarashi, had that footnote that has, ought to have people alarmed, and this is not settled yet. This was just right before the election. That suggested that he thinks part of the ballot design law might violate his order, that might run afoul of where he is in this, in this what's still active litigation to end the line. I think Judge Quarashi would have lost it over putting incumbent on the ballot. I don't think that would have passed. I don't think it would have passed. I don't think that would have withstood the challenge.
I'm sure you're right. Who else has anybody have closing thoughts? Ryan, you want to go?
Yeah, I'll just say, from since I like to say I'm the advanced guru. There were additional on election night there was additional 14,000 mail ballots that came in for the Democrats, and additional 6,000 that came in for the Republicans. So in terms of what the percent of the vote is being mail early voting election day, for the Democrats, once the dust settles, I think 34% are going to vote by mail, and 11% early voting, which is a 45% advance rate, which means 55% of Democrats chose to vote on election day this year, compared to 52% advance in 2024. So there was much higher election day turnout this year than 2024 specifically. Republicans are looking at 18% by mail and 12% early voting, which is 30% advance rate. So 70% of Republicans chose to vote on election day. So bottom line, we're starting to see consistent, similar trends with compared to past recent years, which is nice because, as you know, we haven't really had these historical trends to compare because there's been so much reform in election law recently. So I just want to say, we're starting to see consistency, and New Jersey become really of a hybrid voting state. Mike, I think you tweeted former Ocean County clerk Scott Colbell said we're like a hybrid voting state now. So I would tend to agree with that. So
all the above, yeah.
Yep.
You did a really cool thing in the pre-election one show where you gave what you thought the range of the turnout could be, and I have to say it wound up at the high end of both of your ranges, but you were right there, which was pretty cool.
Yeah. And I also want to give a shout out to most county clerks who make precinct voting district level and municipal level data possible, because we're able to do these really granular comparisons at the town level. Because in a lot of states and a lot of counties, they do not provide this kind of granular data on election night, or especially for free. You have to pay for it in a lot of states. So I just want to say thank you to those clerks that provide that kind of data.
Zach, you want to go next?
Yeah, I don't have too much to talk about, but I'll go back to the Democratic primary for governor. The Sherrill campaign, they've been pushing memos and stuff, saying a lot about how groundbreaking their campaign is. I think they're right in some respects, especially in terms of making up a monetary disadvantage at times. But at the same time, there were still some more traditional aspects of their campaign, especially courting county endorsements and strong endorsements of the like from across the state. And so I think going ahead in the future, it'll be a mixture. This Sherrill campaign will be one to model in many ways, of not only going direct to voter and trying some new things that weren't really necessary or vital in previous New Jersey campaigns, but really just also doing your best to dominate what makes New Jersey, New Jersey. Yeah, thank you.
Joey, go ahead, please.
I think my kind of final point builds off of that, which is to say that Jack Ciattarelli and Micah Sherrill both ran sort of campaigns that would not be all that out of place in the New Jersey of yesteryear, where these were two sort of very competent, very professional campaigns that went to voters directly, but that also, knew how to make the establishment kind of work for them, right? Like Sherrill didn't just get the county party endorsements in all these counties. She made them work for her. She made it actually click. I think that you wouldn't see a lot of the results that you saw on Tuesday if she just had a ballot slogan. It had to be like a whole concerted effort. So Zach, you're right that it's a little bit of a hybrid where there's definitely some element of understanding the reality that we're in now. But there's also these were two campaigns that, publicly or privately, were plotted out for years leading up to this election year, long before a lot of sort of the upheaval that we've seen. And that ultimately worked. So that strikes me as sort of not a victory for the past, but kind of, these are two campaigns that didn't look that dissimilar from the New Jersey campaigns we've seen before, and they were both resounding successes. And then I think as you're looking to the future, a lot of these assembly races where either insurgent candidates won or they came much closer than people expected that's kind of what now the state has to look out for. There's not going to be another gubernatorial primary for 4 years. Presumably one of Sherrill or Ciattarelli will run again in 2029. And so there will only be one side of the gubernatorial primary that year. But these state legislative primaries are going to keep on happening every 2 years. I mean, all 120 seats are going to be up in 2 years. So I think that the sort of state party apparatus and the status quo of the state can look at election night and see some things that will comfort them, that the world has not in fact turned upside down. There are still consistent ways of getting votes. Organizations can still mean something. These are all things in New Jersey that have been true for years, and they continue to be true. But at the same time, they can't take things for granted. There are no guarantees anymore in New Jersey politics, and we're going to be looking at a state of affairs that is just more pluralistic and contains more unexpectedness than I think we've ever seen before.
Yeah,
that was very eloquent.
That was similar. So if there were 42 contests at the county level, right? If you had two Republicans and Democrats statewide, the line without the line held 37, 36 of those races. The organization still held. So that can be true at the same time that 5 or 6 of the times it didn't hold. And so I think it's a prescription both for the parties to plow forward with all those advantages that they still have, minus the line, and also a prescription for those who seek to challenge the line without the line. David, you want to finish this up?
Yeah, a couple things. One is now we're going to see what the role of Governor Murphy is going to be in this campaign. He didn't endorse in the primary, but we have a sitting governor, an outgoing governor, that is whose numbers are okay, and we want to see what he's going to do. One of the things that struck me with the Sherrill campaign is that names that are not household names, Brad Lawrence and Steve D'Amico, political consultants for Message and Media, and they I don't think they've lost a statewide race since the 1990s, and whether it was Torricelli or McGreevy or Corzine or Menendez, they have steadily over almost over 30 years gotten it right in terms of assisting with messaging and modern campaigning, and I don't think there's anybody out there on the from the strategists that have that kind of winning record in major statewide races, and I think it's I find that very impressive. I think we can sort of sit shiva for the newspaper editorial endorsement. Philadelphia Inquirer is a great paper, and they do outstanding reporting in New Jersey, but they endorse Steve Fulop, and in South Jersey, there was no impact to that endorsement at all. As it looks to legislative races going forward, I think what you're going to see is less running mates running joint campaigns and more of in a post-line era, a every man or woman for themselves, because what you saw at the beginning here is sometimes your running mate turns out to be your opponent. And I think you're going to see people take that more seriously, which will raise the already toxic relationships in the Statehouse and will make the assembly more Lord of the Flies than it's ever been. And I think you're going to see legislators sort of wake up and maybe make some changes. And if you're a popular member of the assembly, you might take a shot at the Senate because they're going to be dealing with the same thing where they don't have the lines anymore. And then the very last thing is to our group with Ryder and with On New Jersey. I mean, I am really happy that we did a February debate, because I think that helped make voters, not just rank and file voters, but voters who are county committee members voting at conventions and taking part early and making endorsements. The ability for those at that time 6 Democrats and 4 Republicans to face off and talk about issues and have people be able to compare them on how they answered questions. I think that was good for the process, and I'm just really happy, that we did those. And by the way, no regrets on a 2.5 hour debate in May, because we're all still recovering from that, but it is good to have some substance in the race, and that
as everyone can tell, we can go for almost 2.5 hours, even when there's not gubernatorial candidates lined up in front of us. So we just got it in no matter what.
So, and that's it. That's all I have.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so
Good night.
much.
Have a good night. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.